I loathe you.
I loathe you.
I loathe you first.
Romance. What does the word remind you of? Ugh, stop. Not with the cliche rom-coms again. But you know what? It's not your fault. You are reminded of those because that is how we've been seeing romance. But what if I told you that a soldier going for war is also romantic? A cook discovering new cuisines is also romantic. In fact, you working out passionately makes you a romantic too. Confused? Fret not, my love. I got you. In this video, we will discover romance and find the real meaning of it. What is romance? Swans, red hearts, rings? No, not just that. Romance is something that negates any other form of consciousness. Disturbingly passionate, exaggerated, utterly irrational, or an extreme rebellion against rationality. Romanticism is reclaiming of the self from the increasing mechanism of humans. It is an approach of alienation of industrialization, of capitalism. Unlike our normal understanding of the word romantic, the literary meaning is far different. In Middle Ages, romance as a word was used for new vernacular languages derived from the Latin, and Latin was recognized as a language of learning. If one knew Latin, it meant that they were privileged to know that. Romance is mostly associated with something useless, irrational, something to look down on. Well, romance was recognized as an imaginative word, something opposing the cold-hearted stiffness. All romantic poets were passionate people. They were rebels for reclaiming a sense of self in a world driving away from that notion.
I mean, it's like the president.
So, what's the history? Well, Romanticism, also known as the Romantic Era, was an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, and in most areas was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800 to 1850. Romanticism was characterized by its emphasis on emotion and individualism, idealization of nature, suspicion of science and industrialization, glorification of the past with a strong preference for the medieval rather than the classical. Romanticism in the 19th century movement developed in Europe in response to the Industrial Revolution and disillusionment of the Enlightenment values of reason. Romanticism emerged after the 1789, the year of the French Revolution, that caused a relevant social change in Europe. Based on the same ideals of liberty, fraternity, legality, this new movement was born, aiming to highlight the emotions and the irrational world of the artist and the nature as opposed to the prevalence of reason and rationality. In England, Romanticism was introduced by the first generation of British artists active in Europe between 1760 and 1780, including James Barrie, Henry Fuseli, and John Hamilton Mortimer, who liked to paint subjects that departed from the rigid decorum and the historical or classical mythology of those years. The influence of some English poets such as William Blake and their visionary images led romantic artists to favor bizarre, pathetic, or extravagant themes. Romanticism spread throughout Europe in the 19th century and developed as an artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that embraced various artists such as literature, painting, music, and history. Romanticism was also expressed in architecture through the imitation of older architectural styles. In Germany and England, the medieval Gothic architecture was also influenced by the fantasy and style of the movement, and this renewed interest led to the Gothic revival. The movement emphasized intense emotions as an authentic source of aesthetic experiences, placing new emphasis on such emotions as fear, horror, and terror, and awe, especially that experienced in confronting the new aesthetic categories of the sublime and the beauty of nature. It elevated folk art and ancient custom to something noble, but also spontaneity as a desirable characteristic. The European Romantic movement reached America in the early 19th century. American Romanticism was just as multifaceted and individualistic as it was in Europe. Like the Europeans, the American Romantics demonstrated a high level of moral enthusiasm, commitment to individualism, and unfolding of the self, an emphasis on intuitive perception and the assumption that the natural world was inherently good, while human society was filled with corruption. Romanticism became popular in American politics, philosophy, and art. The movement appealed to the revolutionary spirit of America as well as those longing to break free of the strict religious traditions of every settlement. The Romantics rejected rationalism and religious intellect. It appealed to those in opposition of Calvinism, which included the belief that the destiny of each individual is preordained. The Romantic movement gave rise to New England transcendentalism, which portrayed a less restrictive relationship between God and the universe. The new philosophy presented the individual with a more personal relationship with God. Transcendentalism and Romanticism appealed to Americans in a similar fashion, for both privileged, feeling over reason, individual freedom of expression over the restraints of tradition and customs. It often involved a rapturous response to nature. It encouraged the rejection of harsh, rigid Calvinism and promised a new blossoming of the American culture. Romantic movement in America created a new literary genre that continues to influence American writers. Novels, short stories, and poems replaced the sermons and manifestos of yore. Romantic literature was personal, intense, and portrayed more emotions than ever seen in neoclassical literature. America's preoccupation with freedom became a great source of motivation for Romantic writers, as they were delighted in free expression and emotion without so much fear of ridicule and controversy. They also put more effort into psychological development of their character, and the main character typically displayed extremes of sensitivity and excitement. Romantic architecture appeared in the late 18th century in a reaction against the rigid forms of neoclassical architecture. Romantic architecture reached its peak in the mid-19th century and continued to appear until the end of the 19th century. Gothic Revival architecture was a popular variant of the Romantic style, particularly in construction of churches, cathedrals, and university buildings. In France, one of the earliest examples of Romantic architecture is the Hameau de la Reine, the small rustic hamlet created at the Palace of Versailles for Queen Marie Antoinette between 1783 and 1785 by the royal architect Richard Meek with the help of the Romantic poet Herbert Robert. In the visual arts, Romanticism first showed itself in landscape painting, where from as early as the 1760s, British artists began to turn to wilder landscapes and storms and Gothic architecture. Sculpture remained largely impervious to Romanticism, probably because of the technical reasons, as the most prestigious materials of the day, marble, does not lend itself to expansive gestures. Romanticism, in its true essence, is much more and deep and complex with a range of different aspects and layers as compared to the way it is perceived in the current popular culture. Now that you know what romance means and what comprises of a romantic, it is safe to say that our Vault of Vogue's family preaches Romanticism in the way they are ever enthusiastic to explore, passionate to learn, and courageous to question and seek answers. So, go on, work upon your passion and express it for our family. You know the drill. Subscribe to our channel, comment your views, like our videos, share them with fellow enthusiasts. And until we meet next, stay curious, stay awesome. Volt of Vogues, signing off.